Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the call. If we can have the agenda screen up, please. My name is Allison Cohn. I'm Director of Global Outreach for the Florida Chamber. Today we'll be going over the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Trade Investment Treaty. Edward Steiner will be joining us as our speaker and giving us an overview of those two free trade agreements. I'd like to kick off the meeting by introducing Doug Davidson, who chairs our Florida Trade and Logistics Institute. He's our market executive with Bank of America. Doug?
Great. Thank you, Allison. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. This is Doug Davidson. Well, we are delighted that you've dialed in today to talk about what is a very important topic, and that's the topic of doing business internationally and how these two trade agreements affect the Florida economy and the global economy. I wanted to tell a little bit about why we thought that this was important. Many of you on the line have joined us in the past for discussions regarding international business, whether that's at our International Days event or our Future of Florida event. And we disclosed some important statistics. When it comes to doing business internationally, we found that 80% of global purchasing power, 90% of economic growth, and 95% of the consumers live outside the United States. So certainly markets outside of the United States, whether it's in Europe, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, or the Asia Pacific region, those markets are important to our U.S. domestic companies. In fact, Bank of America conducts an annual survey called CFO Outlook. And for the 2015 survey, we questioned 600 chief financial officers, and a full 73% of those respondents indicated that they are now doing business internationally. In fact, more than 60% are sourcing goods internationally, and more than half are selling internationally. And what I think is remarkable, when we look at the 2014 survey to the 2015 survey, double the number of respondents have indicated that they now have operations outside the United States. So the Florida Chamber of Commerce is very focused on helping businesses in the state reach those markets and making Florida a more competitive place to do business internationally. So we felt that it was important today to talk to you about how these trade agreements are being negotiated and what they'll do for our economies. And I'm delighted to have an expert on the line today who will help facilitate today's call. In today's call, we're joined by Chris Quinn. Chris is a Vice President of Government Affairs for the Jacksonville Chamber of Commerce, and he sits on the Florida Chamber of Commerce's International Business Council, where he is our international policy leader. So I'm delighted to have Chris facilitate today's call with Edward Steiner. And with that, Chris, I'd like to turn it over to you to begin the call.
Thanks, Doug. It's been my honor to serve as the policy chair for the Florida Chamber, and the Chamber's had a long history of supporting overall trade policy. And really to have a successful trade policy, you need to have the components that'll make that successful. And two of the priorities that the Chamber's had on our agenda for some time now have been Trade Promotion Authority, which you all know is passed, and that will be the mechanism by which future trade deals will be vetted by Congress. And then also the reauthorization of Ex-Im Bank, which, as you all know, and for everyone who is at International Days, know that that's a big priority for this chamber, quite frankly, for most chambers across the country. And through those efforts and trips up into D.C. and meeting with our elected officials, I think we're happy to say that in the House of Representatives, there's been a bipartisan push to get signatures to force a floor vote for reauthorization. That vote should occur sometime next week, so we're looking forward to that. It's been a long time coming, but kudos to the Chamber and the staff for meeting with members here in Florida and also going up into D.C. And I can also tell you that sometime in the spring, the Chamber will be going up to D.C. again to continually push our efforts, because that's what we need. We need to be talking about it all the time and making sure that our voice is heard. really why we're talking about these two trade deals today. Mainly because I think we're at the epicenter of all things trade lately. You have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where recently the negotiations have concluded, and now they're going back to the respective countries to be vetted internally. You also have the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership negotiations going on, and as we speak, negotiations going on in Miami. So you have stakeholder meetings going on, presentations, and the actual negotiations being discussed. So Florida right now seems to be at the epicenter of all things trade, and we like to keep it that way. And we're very happy to have with us today to kind of go through those two trade deals and answer any questions we might have. Edward Steiner, who's a Senior Director of International Trade and Government Relations at Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. And we'll be turning the call over to Edward to walk us through those deals. And I'd just like to mention that as we go through that, let's let Edward finish the two presentations so we can get through them, and then we'll take some Q&A at the end of the call. So Edward, I'll turn the call over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to Alice and Doug and to the Florida Chamber for inviting me to speak today to have a conversation about these two trade agreements, the TPP and the TTIP, as we call them in Washington. I'm very happy to talk with you as a representative of Miami-based Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. And please, in your questions, call me Ned. I use Edward to dissuade telemarketers. But in any case, there's a lot to cover today. And as Alice mentioned earlier, this should be a conversation. So I'm going to go through the slides, and hopefully those will raise issues and questions, and we can spend a lot of time having a conversation at the end of the presentation. Just a little background to start off with related to TPP. And we'll start with TPP because that's the agreement that has been negotiated and negotiations have concluded. And TTIP, even though we're in the 11th round, the negotiations in some ways are just getting started. But TPP the negotiations have been completed, and USTR Froman and others are very insistent that the negotiations are closed now and they won't be reopened. So it's kind of interesting when he talks about consultations with Capitol Hill, not quite sure what they're consulting about because they can't change anything, and that's actually going to be an important point looking forward at implementation and approval by the Congress. So in any case, here's some background. It was started by P4 by Brunei, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and then really got ahead of steam when the United States joined, and then later Mexico, Canada, Japan. And as you can see by the numbers, it represents about 40% of global trade and about $28 trillion of global GDP. And some estimates have said that as a result of this agreement, when it comes into full force, there can be savings up to the world economy by about $223 billion by 2025. So here's that snapshot. Now, the agreement has been referred to as a 21st century agreement, a living agreement. And I think what they mean by that is that other countries can join. In fact, their conversations have started already with South Korea about joining. And the idea is to get an agreement that rationalizes the separate bilateral or sub-regional agreements that existed previous between these 12 countries, and to make it a comprehensive agreement. So you have comprehensive market access. It's a fully regional agreement in the sense that there's accumulation. That's a rule of origin term, but allows production in various different countries, and then the product remains an originating product. There's a focus on regulatory coherence, on small and medium enterprises. We know what a driver they are in terms of global growth, and also development. It's very much of a development agreement, an eye on development and helping the less fortunate. I think there's been criticism. Everyone will recognize that trade agreements, for good or for ill, that the criticism has been that they only serve the large multinational companies, and I think there's a real focus on development in this agreement. Also, a new focus on new trade challenges, specifically related to renewable technologies and the digital economy. And as I said at the outset, it's supposed to be a living agreement. Now, it's also, I think you can call it a living agreement because it really doesn't come into effect in some ways in potentially in 10, 12 years. So it has a long life before it really will be completely implemented. So as Chris was saying, you have the next round you had the last round in October of 2015, and that's where they concluded after 5 years of negotiations, and now begins what's called the scrub, which is a legal review, translation, drafting, verifications, and the next step is waiting for the Obama administration to notify Congress formally that they intend to sign the agreement. Now, that's a provision that came into effect under the TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, which requires this advance notice before the president actually signs the agreement. So here's a lot of questions come up about, well, when is this going to come into force? That's what people really care about. They care about the content, and they care about when it's going to be real. And this gives you a sense here, this timeline of just how long it will take, again, based on the congressionally mandated implementation timeline. So first we have to wait for that administration notice to Congress that they're going to sign the bill. And then we have these periods where Congress and the general public get to look at the bill before the president signs. And I would direct your eyes to the bottom where it says the anticipated date. So if we get notification November 1st, this is what the timeline can look like. Essentially, what that means is that if we get the notification November 1st, and if all goes smoothly, which is not at all guaranteed, as we will see, then the earliest we could get the submitting of the implementation bill would be sometime in late April. So it takes about 6 months from notification before signature to submission of the implementing bill. Once the bill is implemented, then Congress is on a strict time clock to approve that bill. But before we get there, there's this long process of, in the name of transparency, before Congress gets the legal, the final legal text and the implementing bill. So now let's say that the bill has been signed. You have the option in terms of when is it going to enter into force. Well, if all countries ratify, then it will be 60 days after those 12 countries ratify. Anticipating that it might take a little bit longer for some countries than others, there's an option 2, which is that 60 days after 6 countries ratify, then it goes into force. But those 6 countries have to represent 85% of combined GDP of the original 12 countries. And what that basically does is it makes it necessary for the U.S. and Japan to be among those 6. So there was a lot of conversation about why was it taking so long, why did it take 5 years, why did they have to do so many rounds. And this is sort of a review of some of the problem areas. I would imagine many of you are familiar with the conversations about patents and protections on pharmaceutical intellectual property. There was this agreement to keep formula secret for 5 to 8 years instead of 12 years. 12 years had been what the U.S. pharmaceutical industries had requested. That's an important point, as we will see. It's a great point of contention. The state-owned enterprises was a big issue, and the U.S. had to overcome objections from a lot of countries that have very robust state-owned enterprises. Dairy and beef were very contentious, and the farming subsidies it remains an issue and has to be tackled. In the automobile industry, we had a very wide variety of responses from Ford Motor Company, which came out opposed to the agreement almost immediately. Other companies have different feelings about the agreement. Some because they felt they got the protection that they needed, in the sense that generally speaking, market access was traded for market access. So if the U.S. gets access to a market, then that country gets access to the U.S. market. But if the other country in question refused access, well, then the U.S. responds in kind. So you have some instances where there's a very, very long phase-in process, which amounts to protection of the U.S. markets. There was as I'm sure you're aware, there was a lot of debate about the ISDS mechanism, the Investor State Dispute Settlement. We'll see that also in our conversation about the U.S.-European agreement. But ISDS was accepted ultimately, but the U.S. agreed to restrictions on tobacco. Basically, the tobacco companies are not allowed to sue countries that restrict or tax cigarettes. That, of course, was not to the liking of the tobacco industry, which is another element of the U.S. industry that might cause problems in terms of getting support for the agreement once it comes to the Hill. So that segues nicely, actually, into the conversation about outstanding issues. Now, just looking at the political environment, while Chairman Ryan on the House side has been fairly positive about the agreement, saying still has some concerns but is reserving judgment, Senator Hatch almost immediately came out in opposition precisely because of that issue on biologics, on the pharmaceutical, the 5 to 8 year versus the 12 year. And that's going to be difficult to reconcile. And I think that's going to be one of the main things that USTR Froman is going to be focusing on, is trying to reconcile that opposition. As I said, pharma has expressed opposition, tobacco, dairy, automobile. Another problem is that you have candidates for the presidency all saying that they're opposed to TPP. Clinton just recently came out and said that she was opposed to it or could not support it at this present time. Bernie Sanders, not surprisingly, has been opposed to it from the outset, and Donald Trump, because he can negotiate everything better, thinks that this is a bad deal. So it's not a clear path going forward, both in terms of industry opposition and in terms of political opposition. I would note also, as you're aware, there's current current issues in House leadership, specifically related to the speakership, and there's conversations about Paul Ryan taking over that position, although he's resisting for good reason, I think. But in any case, that would call into question what happens on the House Ways and Means side, because then you'd have a whole new calculus based on who the new chairman might be. We're far from that decision being made, but currently they're trying to hash out what to do. And of course, we can't move forward until the House has a new speaker. So that's another thing that might delay the process. So it's not only the U.S. that is grappling with these political issues. We see, for example, I had to update the slide this morning because we have a new prime minister in Canada, and he has issued less full-throated support for TPP and wants to see the text before committing. So that's another thing that perhaps complicates the path toward ratification. In some of the countries we see a fairly clear path, but then in Vietnam there's a Communist Party vote coming up at the beginning of next year, which could change that dynamic potentially. Now, and Prime Minister here in Malaysia also running into some legal problems. So, you know, with an agreement with 12 countries and a potentially drawn-out ratification process, I have to say that implementation doesn't appear to be on the immediate horizon. And I would caution people to sort of not start planning as if TPP is just around the corner, and I'd be happy to get into that in a little more detail. So we have both the potential hiccups, if you will, along the path to ratification. The process itself, it can be a lengthy process. And then we sort of, the unknowns about what's going to happen politically that might complicate the ultimate implementation. So obviously the agreement covers a whole range of issues, the complete panoply of products. We could spend all day and then some talking about all the different products, but just to focus on, and we don't have the text yet, is the other thing. So this conversation will be much different once we have the text. And if people have specific industry questions, I'm happy to field those and respond as best I can. I actually have this reference to textiles and apparel because I just got a meeting with Bill Jackson from USTR, who was handling the final phase of negotiation, and he gave me, or gave us, the group, some specifics on what's happening in the textile and apparel chapter, and I can go over those to the extent that folks are interested in that sector. There's a lot of, I think textile and apparel is indicative of what USTR tried to do, balancing the different sides, so to speak, of protection and market access and liberalization of rules. On the one hand, referring to textile and apparel, you have a yarn forward rule, which requires that all yarn and forward originate in TPP countries with very few exceptions. On the other hand, there are phase-outs of duties very quickly. Some in day one, the duties go to zero. Ultimately, all of those chapters will go to zero. And there are different phases that we can go into in greater detail, but so there are a few exceptions to the yarn forward rule, but there's aggressive phasing out of duties. So, and I think that's indicative of the balance that USTR tried to strike. And then you have this common accumulation, as I referred to. I think it's very important that the agreement establishes a TPP-wide system of demonstrating and verifying verifying the bona fides of goods. That has become a real bureaucratic hurdle in terms of different rules for verifying certificates of origin, and having that be harmonized, I think, is going to be a real trade facilitator in this agreement. So as I said, the yarn forward, but then you have the phase outs. There's the labor provisions, there are environment provisions. These are enforceable provisions, and they're integral to the agreement, and part of the dispute settlement chapter. And that was an important element to the Obama administration, and a takeaway that he could bring home, showing that this is sort of the new gold standard, if you will, of trade agreements. Issues related to intellectual property, state-owned enterprises, as we said, as I mentioned before. Currency manipulation, that's been a big issue. In fact, that's why Ford Motor Company opposes TPP, because it doesn't have a quote-unquote enforceable provision related to currency manipulation. It's a real bone of contention, and it'll be a real, I think, central element to those who oppose the agreement, especially coming out of Detroit. That was really a priority for them to have currency manipulation in the agreement. And there are non-binding commitments, but the parties wouldn't commit, and I think a number of them, including the U.S., believe that this should be handled in the context of, say, IMF or other agencies that deal with currency, as opposed to in the trade agreement itself. So that is my overview of TPP, and again, I welcome any questions that we can field. Hopefully we'll have enough time to do that. So now getting into the U.S.-EU. Now, if we were far from implementation, talking about TPP, or even further as far as the TTIP is concerned. I mean, in some ways, as I said, that we're only really just beginning to get into the nitty-gritty of negotiations. In fact, as I'll reference later, there was a state of play document that came out from the European Union, which revealed that although there had been progress in talking about certain cross-cutting issues, that the United States had yet to table proposals or respond to proposals on 8 of the 9 industry chapters that are covered in the agreement. So, as I said, we're some time away from implementation. So, where have we come from in terms of TTIP? In 2013, Obama announces his intention to go forward with TTIP. We sort of went along until really hitting a roadblock in January 2014 because of the ISDS section, and also, if you'll recall, that's when all the information came out about the NSA monitoring programs and Angela Merkel's cell phone, and so that really kind of threw cold water on conversations, especially related to privacy and data protection and so forth. And so you had a new negotiator come in, Cecilia Malmström on the European side in November of 2014. Clear mandate to make the process more transparent and to kind of assuage the concerns and fears about privacy. And you have Froman and Malmström reset the negotiations essentially once they take control, once Malmström comes in, and now we've moved forward, I think, sort of freed up the agreement. That, coupled with the fact that the United States has just completed the TPP negotiations, that has really allowed the U.S. to pivot back to Europe, if you will, after its foray in Asia. So both sides, just to summarize that state of play that I referenced, both sides have exchanged initial tariff offers. And as I said, they've talked about these cross-cutting issues: trade and services, financial services, telecom, e-commerce. They've talked a little bit about procurement, public procurement. They talked about customs, but as I said, still haven't gotten the U.S. to focus on the industry specific offers, which we'll get to in a moment. So here's a snapshot of what TTIP represents. Potential impact: we're looking at 50% of global GDP, 30% of global trade in goods and services, potentially the world's largest bilateral trade and investment agreement. So very ambitious agreements on the horizon. TPP and now TTIP could have a great effect on the trade picture. So here's an overview of the content of the agreement. You see there traditional areas like market access, but what's interesting is that if you look at trade between the U.S. and Europe, first of all, there are a lot of low tariff areas. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 2-3%. There's a lot of trade intra-company, and so as has been commented on extensively, a lot of folks look at this agreement as a benefit for a couple of reasons outside of the traditional market access, lowering tariffs. One of those is regulatory coherence. Basically there's this idea that both the U.S. and the EU deliver the same level of safety or quality, but they have differences in terms of the technical details or the procedures for checking to see if firms have met the rules, that certification, testing, labeling, those kinds of things. And so that aspect, if there can be this regulatory coherence, that's going to facilitate trade greatly. And the other is that if the United States and Europe can agree to these ground rules and agree to these standards, that could possibly set the global stage for conversation about for global standards, because of the importance that the trade agreement represents, and you might have other countries following suit. And so in a way, it's a kind of an oblique way of getting at a multilateral agreement, because you have such large players making agreements in these areas, that others will follow suit. There you see a list of regulatory cooperation in the industrial sectors that we talked about, and the cross-cutting issues of sustainable development, dispute settlement, et cetera. So here's another way of looking at it. As I said, addressing TBTs, technical barriers to trade, looking for convergence in regulatory approaches, reducing redundant testing certification requirements. Now, what's interesting and sort of part of the overarching drama is the different U.S. and EU approaches. The EU approach is much more prescriptive. They have a process, and they have results, and they'd like to try to codify that, and they try to make it very clear and very specific and detailed. Whereas the U.S. is more interested in sort of maybe a process, a general approach, really focusing on the end goals of equivalency, not necessarily doing it exactly the same way. And so that's a pretty significant philosophical difference between the United States and Europe. And I think that's probably what accounts for the fact that the U.S. hasn't wanted to dive into the industry-specific chapters, because it wants to first get the philosophy of regulatory coherence in areas like services or state-owned enterprises. Or they want to get that philosophy, that agreement down first before going into the specifics. Now, as I said, the intra-company aspect of this is going to be very important. So really focusing on services, focusing on movement of people, licensing and certification of professional service providers. You want to have that kind of mutual recognition in place. There's an interest in facilitating electronic commerce. Everybody's very excited about the internet, but also concerned that governments will do things that will unintentionally have effects on e-commerce. But also there are concerns by quote unquote bricks and mortar retail companies and the retail sectors that are concerned that e-commerce has an unfair advantage, and so there certainly will be discussion about taxation. And as I said before, the conversation about digital trade and data flows has become much more complicated, both because of what had happened with the NSA, but more recently on the 6th of October, don't know how much of you are aware of the safe harbor ruling by the European Court of Justice, which basically said that that the U.S. provisions, the federal provisions for the protection of data, were insufficient for EU purposes, which basically allows individual countries to enact their own additional data protection laws, which would very much complicate the picture. Now, the decision says essentially that the U.S. does not now have sufficient protection, leaving the door open for Congress to pass new law that creates sufficient protection. But this does definitely throw a spanner in the works in terms of conversations about data flows, and data privacy, which is essential to e-commerce, but it's also very important in terms of the overall services sector and the services sector that support the other sectors. So it ends up being a very central issue, and so we're watching developments on that front very carefully. So as I said, the U.S. Now this is of course the European the Commission grousing about the U.S. not putting forward any proposals, but as I said, it might have to do with, well, a combination of things. One is that philosophical difference that I was talking about, but also, quite frankly, the U.S. has been focused on TPP. Now that TPP has been completed, U.S. will have more bandwidth, so to speak, to really get into the weeds on TTIP. So there's exactly what I just said. So next steps. Now, Miami, as Chris was saying earlier, is hosting the 11th round of TTIP negotiations right now, this week. So you must be very excited about that, and they're hosting a stakeholder forum tomorrow on the 21st. For those of you who are interested in camping out and hope to get a glimpse of one of the celebrity negotiators, I'm being facetious, but I would encourage folks to be involved and stay informed about what's going on, because both the U.S. and Europe are making great efforts to be transparent and to incorporate people's industry and individuals' concerns and perspectives, particularly from a small and medium enterprise perspective. They do really want to hear from you. So it's important to stay involved. I also would encourage you to identify your European counterparts, because that's a way of getting more bang for your bucks, so to speak. That is, if you're advocating and you're lobbying or what have you, you're U.S. representatives, while your counterparts are doing the same on the European side. That makes it that much easier to include your objective in the negotiation text because there's concurrence on both sides. So just as we saw with TPP, there are also problems, sensitive topics in TTIP, some of which I've referenced before. But as I said, we're still in the negotiation phase with TTIP, so these are issues that could potentially derail the agreement entirely. On GMOs, for example, on genetically manipulated organisms, the EU has a precautionary principle, sort of, if there's a potential for a health risk or other kind of risk, then it'll rule out products. That's not just GMO. That's other things as well. Whereas the U.S. has more of an ex post facto. We'll sue you if it's if we find something wrong with the product. But as I said, it's not just a GMO. The U.S. uses antibiotics and growth hormones, different kinds of sanitation methods, and the EU, whereas the U.S. considers these to be not related to health and sort of not protected by public health concerns, the EU thinks they are, and so they consider them detrimental to human and animal health. So there's a real debate there, philosophical debate on some of these issues. On financial services, a very central part of the agreement. Europeans want more control in the TTIP. Americans think that this is an international issue, international finance. It should be left to international bodies like the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, and the International Organization for Security Commissions. So internationalizing it as opposed to just keeping it in between TTIP. There's concerns about the environment. We'll get to that in a section. And I said data privacy, always a big issue. I think in some ways it's the main issue that drives opposition in Europe. So we have the proponents, not surprisingly, Chamber of Commerce, Transatlantic Business Council, Business Roundtable, and then you've got the opponents on the other side, also a little bit usual suspects, consumer organizations, and Friends of the Earth, World Wildlife. I mean, I think it's interesting. There's a concern that if Europe does business with the United States, that will lower European standards. So it doesn't say much for their opinion about U.S. government, but that's a concern. If you have harmonization or coherence or however you want to phrase it, that they're concerned that this is going to be a race to the bottom, and so the negotiators are doing what they can to assure them otherwise. And Obama on the U.S. side, and Malmstrom on the EU side, they both come from the center left, and so they need to be very aware and responsive to those elements, both because they're important parts of their political base, but also because they could potentially derail the agreement. So here's some quotations from U.S. officials. So this idea of foreign policy is economic policy. Idea of trade facilitation, an important mantra as far as TTIP is concerned. So one of the reasons why I wanted to present TPP first is because you had that timeline, essentially 6 months if everything works between the notification and because the president notifying Congress and sending up an implementation bill. Now, I should also say that it has happened that even though the law says that Congress has to pass or reject a trade bill that's set up by the administration, it has happened in the past that that there were delays, that leadership, the case that I'm thinking about in particular was with the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, that then Speaker Pelosi was able to unplug the TPA clock and stop consideration of Colombia. So it is, even though the law says that Congress has to consider it, we know that in the past Congress found a way around that. So I don't think just because you have an implementing bill, you're necessarily home free. I mean, you can have delays along the way, you can have it be derailed, you could have a no vote, but in any case, there's a little bit more of a structure once you get a bill. You do have a countdown, and that's a little bit more predictable. But between notification and that clock starting, you have all these new windows for the agreement to be viewed and the implementing bill to be viewed. So whereas as you can see on the EU side, it's a little bit more straightforward. Part of that is because the negotiators more closely represent Parliament and the Commission, and they really can't go forward unless they feel like they have the approval of those institutions, and so they really have that mandate in a way that the president doesn't have, particularly a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. But we're still not at this point. So, but this is just kind of a snapshot of what has to happen once the agreement, once there is agreement, once you have an Atlanta moment for TTIP. So now it's question time, and I think I'm going to turn it over to the organizers to field questions, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Ned. Blake, I think if you can unmute the lines, and we can start with some questions. If you have a
All guests have been unmuted.
If you have a question for Ned, just please give your name, who you're with, and then the question, and we'll go from there. Ned, since everyone's a bit bashful, I'll start off with a question for you. Looking at the timeline for all these trade deals, and in particular, I'm asking for TTIP. You know, I've heard folks talk that you're looking at a deal not being concluded on TTIP until the new administration comes around, after Obama has left office. How much of an issue do you think possibly that TTIP could be an election issue, and you could have new members of Congress in there? So how does that play into everything?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think there are a lot of different elements to that question. I'll try to get through those quickly. I mean, I think on the one hand, as I said, we're still in negotiations. So and Malmstrom made it clear that, I mean, she didn't think there was any way that it could be done by the end of the year. And I think there's pretty broad consensus that that's not going to happen. You still have so much unresolved in the agreement. I'd be very surprised to see that go forward, especially with all of the sort of dynamics that are involved in the push towards transparency and so forth. So that means that you're going to have, and also I think the fact of TPP is very important. Yes, it's true you don't have the negotiators, the U.S. negotiators working on TPP anymore, and they can focus on the EU. but you're still going to have the USTR and other folks occupied with trying to sell this on the Hill and more broadly in the general public. And I think that's going to take away from the momentum of TTIP. Also, politically, I mean, the president's going to bring up 2 trade bills, one that is publicly opposed to both leading candidates in the Democratic Party. It's hard to believe, especially because now TPP, as we saw on the timeline, maybe you get an implementing bill. We're going to see the language fairly soon, so all of the opposition will come out of the woodwork, and there'll be campaigns against it and campaigns for it, and but we won't see a bill until late spring. The closer you get to the election, the harder it is to pass that bill, especially if the candidates are, if we have a clear nominee and the candidates are giving more sort of full-throated opposition. It's going to be harder and harder for Congress to go against their nominee. That would tend to undermine the nominee. So from a pro perspective, I mean, the president and the other supporters are going to want to get this the TPP done as soon as possible. So and that takes up a lot of bandwidth. So the idea that TTIP is not as controversial as TPP is, but it has plenty of controversy. And trade opponents sometimes don't stand on ceremony, and a trade bill is a trade bill, and if they could get one of these defeated, that would be a real feather in their cap. So I don't think they're going to want to push it. And this isn't something I think this is something either that you would want to do in a lame duck environment. I think that the new president will want to put his or her imprimatur on the agreement, just as Obama did with Korea, for example, and with Colombia and the labor agreement and so forth. So I think in all likelihood, whether or not TPP gets done, TTIP, I think, gets pushed to the next administration, even if negotiations are concluded. I think it would be very ambitious to think that it would be concluded under the current administration. That's a very long-winded response, but it's a complicated environment, and I just don't see how you could expedite that.
That's great. Thank you. Are there any other questions out there?
Be interested to know what industries, sectors, or folks particularly interested in.
Hi, Ed. This is Doug Davidson. To that question, I would say the interest aligns with Florida's economy. Certainly Florida's economy is based on a three-legged stool: agriculture, tourism, and then construction and growth. The Florida Chamber has been instrumental in seeking to build on those 3 pillars and to bring in aerospace and defense, trade and logistics, clean tech, biotech, et cetera. And so I think supporting, augmenting those 3 pillars and aligning with what we see as the vision for the job creation in the state of Florida is of most interest to this group. I also want to say thank you, and I know, Chris, you'll bring the call to a close in a minute, but I just want to say thank you for leading this call today. You did an incredible job in articulating 2 very complex agreements in a way that many of us listening can follow along closely. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. It's my pleasure. And perhaps we can have another conversation once we have the text and we can look at the specific industries and the specific provisions and go into greater detail then. I'm not familiar offhand with where we are in defense and aerospace. But I think given the fact that you have folks like Senator Nelson on the Finance Committee, I'm sure that those issues are addressed in the agreement. The one thing I would say is, again, as I said at the outset, is that we do have the TPP agreement. We don't have it signed yet. And is somebody else on the line?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ned.
No, sure. Thanks. No, I was just going to say that we don't have it signed yet, and we're not close to implementation. And some of the provisions are going to be phased in, and I think it's very important to look at those phase-ins. And I was as I said earlier, mentioned earlier, I have a conversation with Bill Jackson at USTR. Some of the phase-ins are 10 or 12 years, so you need to look at what kind of product specifically you're talking about, and see where they are in the schedule. And then again, we have to make sure that the agreement is ratified and that it's implemented. Another little hiccup too that I didn't talk about was the United States has this mechanism where it goes around and it certifies whether or not the legislative drafts that come out of the other countries does in fact implement what was agreed to in the negotiation. So that kind of adds yet another layer in the process. But as far as the industry-specific question about defense and aerospace, I think it'll be useful to look at the text when it comes out. And as I said, I'd be happy to have another conversation when that becomes available.
Well, Ned, thank you very much. And I also wanted to thank before we close Lee Sandler, who is the chair of our International Business Council and who was gracious enough to lend your expertise to us today. So thank you very much, and thank you to Lee for helping set this up. Before we close, just want to mention everyone. I'm sure you received emails, but in case you hadn't, International Days, February 23rd to 24th in Tallahassee. So make sure registration is open. Make sure you go to the website, check it out. It'll be another great event. And as the agenda gets finalized, you'll get some more insight into what's going on. So I want to thank everyone on the call, Doug, Alice, and Ned especially. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day and giving us a briefing on two major trade deals.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.